What do you do if you don't know your birth time and you would like an astrology reading? One of the most common questions I get asked is, can I have a birth chart reading or can I have a birth chart if I don't know my birth time? And the short answer is yes, you can. In this video, I'm going to give you a real life example of a client that come to see me without a birth time. They were born 1951, so there was no way to contact the hospital. It had since moved or shut down or been renovated and lost the records. Both parents had passed away and the client had no idea of their birth time. And within about 15 minutes of her consultation, I was able to rectify the birth time in her birth chart to a pretty accurate 15-minute window of the likelihood of a birth time. So in this video, I'm going to give you a live demonstration of just how I did that. Before we get there, what I want to say is this. An accurate birth time gives us an accurate birth chart. But for a lot of people, it's not common knowledge. In fact, your birth time is not printed on your birth certificate. So if you're looking for your birth time, don't order a new birth certificate because it's usually not there, at least in Australia. But there are some things that you can do. So the first obvious place to start if you don't know your birth time is ask your parents, your caregivers, or your relatives. Now, if they're not haven't recorded that or don't have a baby book or it's not written down somewhere and it was some time ago, the information might be a little bit vague or non-existent. What we want to first establish is there a window of time for your birth? An example is, Mum, what time was I born? Oh, I'm not sure. I went into hospital about 7 a.m. in the morning, and I know by lunchtime you'd been born. Okay, so we've got a window between 7, maybe 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning to midday. That window of time is a lot better to work with when we're trying to work out birth time than just saying, well, it was any time throughout the day. I don't know. It could have been, morning, noon, afternoon, don't know. So if we have a window of time, then we'll start with what we know. So, you might have other people that say, oh, I think it was between, 9 and, 11 at night. Okay, so that's a perfect window. Why was it between 9 and 11? Well, I'd finished work for the day, I'd gone home and I went into labor after dinner. But you were definitely born on that date because, the next after midnight is the next day. So then we're sort of working with these little tiny parameters, and that's very useful information. So we start there. So let's say you ask around or you can't for whatever reason. Maybe you were adopted, maybe your parents passed away, maybe there's no one to ask, or maybe they just have no memory whatsoever. So the next thing that you can do is you can contact the hospital you were born at and ask for a live birth record. This is the record that the doctor and midwife sign when you come into this earth, and it'll have like your, weight, your length, the head circumference, all those details. And usually the live birth record will show the birth time. Under Australian law, it's supposed to keep that record for 120 years. And under the Freedom of Information Act, you are entitled to a copy of your live birth record. But it's not freely sort of just easily accessible given out. Some hospitals will have that information on hand and they can look it up in a database and give it to you, and it's quite quick and efficient. Other hospitals have archived that information, and you're going to have to go through a bit of a paper trail to obtain a copy of it. But some clients at the moment going through a process where it's about 28 days, they've had to fill in some forms, and in 28 days, they're going to get a copy of their birth chart. The key to finding your birth chart, your birth time this way, is to be persistent. Because if you get someone that's a little busy on administration and they can't be bothered and they're getting like 50 calls a day, oh, what's my birth time? They might give you the runaround. They might be dismissive. They might say, oh, we don't have that information. So be persistent because it's your record. It's your record of your live birth. So it's yours. So that information is yours. You're entitled to it under the Freedom of Information Act. You just have to be persistent. If the hospital is shut down, burnt down, closed down, renovated, then they may have archived that information. If the records have been destroyed, then we go to the next step. So there is no birth time, there's no knowing, no one knows the dates, no one knows the times, it's just an unknown. So here's what I want to give you as my example with my client that come to see me recently of how we, in that instance, used some certain techniques with regards to consultation, and then we moved her birth chart around to sort of narrow down the most likely birth time. And I'm going to explain how I did that now. So it is common practice in astrology when we don't know the birth time to set the birth time for 12 p.m. in the daytime. And the reason we do that is because we're at the halfway point of that particular date of birth. In this case, my client was the 9th of March, 1951. So the date of birth, the 9th of March, gives people Pisces, Sun at 17 degrees. So everyone born on the 9th of March is going to have their Sun in Pisces at 17 degrees. Doesn't, irrespective of when or what year or what time, if they were born on the 9th of March, your Sun is at 17 degrees of Pisces. That's a given. That's a fixed sort of, something we can rely upon. So we set the chart for 12 p.m. and we say, okay, well, now we're working with either 12 hours earlier or 12 hours after or around that particular time. So very quickly, what I noticed in this chart was that she was born under a new moon phase. However, at 12 p.m., the moon was at 2 degrees of Aries. And we know that the moon spends about 2.5 days in each sign. And it's going to move roughly a degree every 2 hours. So I was already thinking to myself, well, there are only 2 moon options for this particular person. If she was born at 12 p.m. in the day or after, she's going to have an Aries moon. But I was curious to find out at what time during the day the moon had moved into Aries. In other words, on this particular date, 9th of March, 1951, the moon would have moved from Pisces and into Aries at a particular time. So straight away, I was like, okay, we've got a really unique little alignment here to work with, because she's either going to be a Pisces moon or an Aries moon, depending on the time she was born. And what I know about people with Pisces moon as opposed to Aries moon is they're a lot different in their emotional responses, how they respond emotionally, how they emotionally react, what they need in sense of security. There are different drives, different needs, different basic sort of subconscious reactions for those energies. And being from mutable water Pisces to cardinal fire Aries, there's a big difference. So the first thing I wanted to do was ask her about her emotions, her mother and her family. And she told me that, she was a sensitive type. She was close to her mother. Her mother was very nurturing, very passionate, and she had a really close relationship with her. And I was sort of thinking, okay, that's interesting. I would sort of put that more into Pisces than I would to Aries. But then something interesting happened. I asked her about her early childhood experiences, and she said, well, look, really, to be honest, I didn't spend much time with my parents because I was shipped off to boarding school at the age of 6. It's like, whoa. And I said, so how often did you see your parents? She said, very, very rarely. Spent most of my childhood and early adolescence at boarding school. So I was like, wow, that is super interesting. Okay, so there is this sort of isolation from family at a very young age. Isolation from family. So yes, that's Pisces energy to a degree, sense of abandonment, but it's also the 12th house. That's a 12th house signature. So one thing I did really quickly is within the session, I moved the chart backwards in time to get the sun at least in the 12th house. And something interesting happened when I did that, as you'll notice here in the chart, is when I move her chart back to 7 a.m. in the morning, same date of birth, but now we're looking at 7 a.m. Her sun now is in the 12th house, and her moon is conjunct the ascendant here, but in Pisces, no longer in Aries. It's like, wow. If the moon is conjunct the ascendant, there is generally a close relationship to the mother, especially early in life, or a close bond with the mother. that can be, functional or dysfunctional. Can be a tyrant of a mother that kept you really close and made you really dependent upon her and demeaned you and all belittled, or it can be a really close emotional connection with their mother figure. So started to make a little more sense, her chart, with the birth time in the morning. Then she'd mentioned at the age of 6 that she was shipped off to boarding school and she spent most of her childhood away from her family. Now, in this chart for 7 a.m., she would be Pisces rising, and Pisces rising are very sensitive. They tend to experience their reality through their emotions. So they're very sensitive to the energies of others, the emotions of other people. And it certainly was starting to sort of come across this way, this particular person, more so than Aries. More Aries are more self-orientated, self-directed, assertive. They're more independent types, whereas you find the Piscean types tend to be a little bit more sensitive. So that was starting to sort of, pick my interest. And if she was born at 7 a.m. Pisces rising, down here on her fourth house cusp is Gemini. And in her fourth house of family is Uranus. So knowing that at the age of 6 is when she went away from her family, so she started to have more of a 12th house experience, I was like, what was happening via progression for her at the age of 6? So a progression is we take the birth chart and we progress it in time, and we move it in accordance to the age of the person. So this birth chart on the 9th of March 1951, that was 0 age. I was born on that day. If we want to go to the year 6 of the person, we progress the chart forward 6 days from birth. We're then looking at the 6th year. So I don't have to calculate that now. Beautiful people at Astro Gold have this fantastic software where I can just look that up and progress the chart very quickly. So we look here, secondary progressions, calculate. That's for right now, that's secondary progression. That's 3rd of May 2024. What I want to do is take it back. So interesting things happening around that particular time is that Mercury now has moved into a conjunction with her rising sign. Now, at 7 a.m., she has 28 degrees rising. Mercury has progressed at 27 degrees here. So it's moved into a conjunction to here. So I'm starting to think, okay, at age 6, Mercury is on her ascendant. If Mercury's in the 12th house conjunct the ascendant, then the themes of Mercury in her chart are going to be very accentuated, active. Mercury rules 2 signs. Mercury rules the sign of Virgo and the sign of Gemini. So Mercury rules the 7th house cusp in this chart and also Gemini down here. So the ruler of her 4th house, which is Mercury through Gemini, had come into a conjunction with her ascendant at the age of 6. So it's like, wow, the experience of her home and family massively changed at that age. The other thing that I noticed really quickly was that when she was born, Uranus was in her 4th house, but retrograding. So red color here means retrograding. And by the age of 6, Uranus is now black here in a progress chart. So Uranus had turned direct. In other words, within 6 days after she was born, there was a Uranus station direct. When there is an outer planet that stations direct or retrograde in a progress chart, there is usually significant things happening around that time. Uranus deals with change, but also with outcast, right? Uranus type people can tend to be the outcasts, aloof, eccentric, even like little strange. Little strange for this person to be at the age of 6 away from her home. Uranus is being in her 4th house, and the quality of her experience with regards to her home, her 4th house, her family, her 4th house, massively changed at the age of 6. So both Mercury here moving into a conjunction to ascendant and Uranus turning direct were big indicators for me to say, okay, we're probably in the ballpark now. Now, because at 7 a.m. the rising sign degree is 28 degrees, we could be looking a few minutes either side of 7 a.m. In fact, if I was to take this chart now and use it, you move it by minutes, at 6:56 a.m., she has 27 degrees Pisces rising. Now we put the progressions on and find that Mercury is now in a really strong conjunction. If I go back a little further and give her 26 degrees, by the age of 6, Mercury has moved out of her 12th house, which it's home in the 12th house, and moved into the first house. And she's had some very personal mercurial stories emerge at that age, right? So the progression of this Mercury into her first house shifted the quality of her home environment. She moved out of the home and away from her family and her parents. It definitely resonates that experience with the sun in the 12th house, and also with the moon in Pisces rather than Aries. And the other thing is that we established very early on that she was close to her mother figure. So now I'm starting to think, okay, that's probably closer to the time of birth than we know. Now, one other thing stood out to me, and again, through looking at what that was and asking questions, I was able to define that experience of that energy. And that is Saturn in her 7th house, retrograding in Virgo. So she has Saturn retrograde in the 7th house, directly opposite her moon. So there's a massive polarity between her emotional needs and authority figures in her life. The questioning that I had around that was, what was the experience for her of relationships, key, intimate, life partner marriages? And she'd been married for a long time, divorced, had children to her first marriage, and then she'd met another person. A little bit later, they had shared children, but no children together. So what was the reason for her first marriage ending? And she said because he was abusive, critical, demeaning, and he instilled a lot of fear into her around her being no good, not worthy, worthless. Without him, without his power and control, she'd be nothing. She'd be alone. No one would want her. And, there was a mixture of verbal, emotional, and even sometimes physical abuse at the hands of a very strict, overbearing, authoritarian, demeaning, belittling partner. Whoa. Saturn at the 29th degree of Virgo retrograde on the descendant in the 7th house. That describes that person very well. The 7th house relates specifically to relationships. This first house is about the self, and the opposite house is others. Now, others in the sense of who we are in close personal relationship to. So the 7th house is often an indicator for our life partner, our marriage partner, our long-term lover, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, whatever you want to call that. They fall into that 7th house. In this 7th house, she also has Neptune here, and that's in conjunct her Pisces. So boundaries and selflessness, so she was a very selfless person, and she sacrificed a lot in relationship until it got too much, until there was a break point, until she'd had enough, until she just finally got up the courage to say enough is enough. And she does have a very dominant Mars in the first house in Aries. But Mars in the first house in Aries, it's squaring Uranus. Okay, so it's conflicted, or it's challenged at least, by independence, freedom. Will she be able to be independent and free outside of the control of a relationship? And also because she had early childhood abandonment, she didn't want to experience being abandoned or rejected. So in order for her not to be abandoned or rejected, she's very selfless to others, but at her own detriment, because she was not able to put boundaries in place to protect her from people that were not good for her. Hence marrying someone that was quite abusive and not very good for her. Until one day, her Mars awakens and she says, enough is enough. And she becomes confident, courageous, assertive, and direct to say, I am Aries, done. So when we understand the story, understand the stories, and we understand the patterns, we can then rectify the birth time based on that to fit the energies into those experiences. Was she born at 6:45, 7 or 7:15? We're in that very, very ballpark. I would say that most likely she was probably born between 6:45 and 7 a.m. in the morning. Now that gives us a pretty accurate chart. With this chart now, we've got a rising sign. The degree is in question, but we know the rising sign, and we know now the positions of the planets within the houses. And then in this particular session, we went on and on and on, and at every point of discussion in relation to her and her life, the chart reflected more and more and made more and more sense. There were many, many reinforcements that validated this particular chart throughout that session. So here's a client that's come to see me without knowing a birth time and no way in which to obtain a copy of her birth time. But very quickly, through discussion, through asking the right types of questions, we're able to rectify the birth time of the chart to be very, very accurate. So if you're out there and you're wanting an astrology reading, but you don't know your birth time, go through those steps, ask around, find the baby book, get a window of time. If that doesn't work, contact the hospital you were born at for a copy of your live birth record. If that doesn't work, we can still read your chart based on a 12 p.m. time. And throughout that session, we usually are able to narrow down to one or two possible rising signs. The interesting thing about the rising sign, the ruler of the rising sign, the position of the ruler of the rising sign, the planets in the first house and connected to the ascendant in particular, tell us a lot about your birth. They tell us a lot about your appearance and tell us a lot about the way in which you interact in this world with others and how you go about things, especially things you're doing for the first time. So even your very introduction can come across as, your rising sign expresses. I had a client last night, Aries rising, Aries sun in the first house. And as soon as we sat down in conversation, that energy came straight out of me. It was like, very bright, very, hey, going, very quick, very direct, very energetic. And it was just like, there is the expression of cardinal fire coming through this person in his very initial interaction with me, the very first time we meet. And I experienced the raw, innocence of Aries quality coming through the person. So when you've, read a lot of charts, when you've consulted with a lot of people and you've looked at a lot of charts, you start to get a bit of a feel to the qualities of the energies of the signs. And then very quickly, if someone comes to me and they're not sure of their birth time, and they think it's a certain time, and I find that it's close to a change within the rising sign, I'll sort of go, I don't think you're Gemini rising. I think you're Taurus rising. Just by the way in which you're expressing to me and how you come across, that comes across more Taurian than it does Gemini. So point of the story is this: yes, you can have a birth chart reading without a birth time. Even if we're unable to work out the birth time, there's still a lot of very good, insightful, and helpful information that can be obtained from your chart just by setting it at 12 p.m. We can look at all of the planetary placements within the signs and the alignments between those planets and bring a lot of information that's very useful to you. So if you're curious about astrology, but you don't know your birth time, don't stress. It's okay. I got you. It's all good. Yes, you can have a chart reading if you don't know your birth time. And you never know. We may just be able to work it out for you. Peace out.